Hi, welcome to the DRH show, where I have wide-ranging conversations with interesting people. We talk about all things psychology, mental health, and wellness. Today, I'm joined by a psychologist who also works within the higher education, Dr. Lee Keys. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's great to have you here, Dr. Keys. So let's start off with you telling us your backstory, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Okay. Well, that's a long story. I'm from North Carolina, originally in the U.S. I have been working as a psychologist for 30 years. Very early in life, I was very curious about human beings and how they function, and I wanted to understand a lot of things about that. I have worked in higher education. I've worked in private practice, hospital settings, and so forth. And currently, I'm doing part-time private practice along with some consulting work. I also like to say that my main ethnic origins are Scottish, and that informs a lot of what I do, believe it or not. So that's me.
It's quite a journey from having a Scottish origin, and now you're an American. But even so, you're still working within the higher education. And I understand that you predominantly work with mental health in adolescents. So if you could just give us a snapshot of the mental health landscape among adolescents and young adults today.
Okay. Well, it's a complicated picture in some ways, but in other ways, it's simpler than it seems. A lot has been written about what's been called a mental health crisis among young adults and adolescents. What is clear from the data, however, is that there are high levels of distress. You will find that repeatedly in a lot of studies that have been done. The issue with that is that distress does not necessarily translate to disorder. I think there's been some conflation about that fact, where high levels of distress are interpreted as high prevalence of disorder, but I don't believe that to be true. In many ways, young adults are doing better than they used to. Even in the pandemic, we know that the pandemic has not affected everyone equally or the same. Some groups actually did better. For example, we know that young people who spent more time at home in the pandemic, significant numbers of them reported actually doing better. They had concerns about school and their career path, but more time with family, less time engaged on social media, especially the conflicts that can arise in social media, actually help them. And I think it's important that we drill down further into what is causing the distress. That is the question that needs to be answered, and I'd like to see more studies done on that, frankly. So it doesn't just help to say young people are highly distressed or young people have such and such disorders. We have to ask the question, why? Why is that? Why is that happening now?
And from your experience, would you say that there's a mental health crisis going on? Because a lot of mental health professionals, even academics, some of them are actually skeptic to say that there's actually a mental health crisis. But from your own experience and from your own background, would you say that there's a mental health crisis? And I understand that prior to this interview, you would like to reference a picture to help you with your explanation. But due to technical difficulties, I won't be able to do that. But what I'll do is I'll put a link to that picture that you want to reference. But yeah, just to give us a snapshot, would you say that there's a mental health crisis going on in relation to the mental health of adolescents and young people?
Yes. Well, in its most general sense, you can say there are mental health issues definitely among adolescents and young adults. But I think it's best described as high rates of distress. The answer to the question why, I think, is complicated, but I'm going to simplify it some by talking about the concept of dystopia. Dystopia, as you and your listeners know, is a frightening and negative community. That's all it takes for something to be dystopic. Right now, young adults are facing all sorts of issues, including loss of trust in society's great institutions, education, the church, government, environment, and so forth. And you can find this repeatedly referenced in some very large-scale studies. You will see that over and over again. This loss of trust raises all sorts of questions and predicaments for them. So, for example, we can just take one, education. A lot of young adults are questioning the value of education at this point. They ask themselves, do I really want to take on this amount of debt to educate myself when there is no guarantee or a poor probability of having a satisfying, productive career? Is that career going to be able to help me pay a mortgage or have a home or have children? And for a lot of young adults, they're answering that question, no, it is not. Enrollment rates in higher education institutions are flattening, in some cases dropping. I think largely because of that. But they ask the same questions related to things like environment and government. I think that was much more intense during the time of 2016 to 2020 due to various political changes that were going on across the world, really. That may be improving at this point. It may not. I think time will tell. But when you're living in a dystopic environment, it produces all sorts of mental health issues related to that. Depression, fear, anxiety, a sense of hopelessness or helplessness, and so forth, stagnation, and so forth. And that, I think, is more representative of the rates of distress that we're seeing than disorders per se. Now, it's also true that when distress is higher, there can be a similar outcome with eventual disorders. But I think if we just focus on disorders, we're missing a bigger picture, and that is context. The cartoon that you're speaking of addresses context. It is not accurate to diagnose, for example, while we disregard the entire context the person is living in. So there can be contextual diagnoses, although those don't appear in any formal diagnostic manuals and so forth. So I think that's the main reason, in my opinion, behind the trends that we're seeing. And I think we respect adolescents and young adults more when we appreciate their context and when we actually listen to what they are saying, okay?
This actually reminds me of some of the audience or some of the listeners might not be aware that you actually write articles for PsycReg. And about 3 years ago, you wrote an article entitled, "Are we transmitting anxiety to the next generation?" Would you please expand on that article that you wrote about? Is there really a risk of older generation transmitting anxiety to the next generation? And of course, we're not just talking about the kind of mental health landscape that we have right now, which is pandemic. Obviously, it's laden with anxiety, but even before the pandemic, there's a lot of things going on. So yeah, do we think we're in essence transmitting anxiety to the next generation?
Yes. Well, I'm a parent myself, and parenting is one of the most difficult jobs, responsibilities that exists. And I'm a trained psychologist. And so if it's difficult for me, I know it can be difficult for others. But parents do transmit to their children. They transmit not only good things, but potentially bad things as well. So let's go back to this notion of dystopia. Parents are also dealing with dystopia in some ways. They don't always know how to approach this or solve issues. Many of them experience anxiety and fears and hopelessness about this. And the children, of course, will pick up on that. But beyond that, a family member may have anxiety issues themselves, independent of what's going on culturally or contextually. And if they're not doing well with that, and if they're not careful, that can be transmitted to children. There have been studies relating to this directly. So for example, if you have a parent who is highly socially anxious or has a lot of fears, phobias, things like that, the children will witness that. They will watch how the parent is coping or not coping, and through modeling can adopt some of those same behaviors and patterns. This is part of what makes parenting such an enormous responsibility. We're all human and we all make mistakes. That this is not about perfection. This is about tuning into how we are coping as adults, watching that carefully, being responsible about our own coping skills and methods so that we can transmit positive things to our children. Now, it's not just parents that transmit anxiety. It's really anyone around them. And in some ways, peers pass along this kind of transmission as well. There are some studies that show that adolescents, for example, are influenced far more by their peers than they are their parents. Of course, by the time you're an adolescent, you've already learned a lot of things from your parents. So it can be both.
Now, what I'd like to hear from you, Dr. Keith, is as a parent and as a psychologist, do you think we should be hopeful about our young people?
Absolutely, I do. In fact, our President Biden, just spoke about this yesterday, but I see all signs of hope for young adults and adolescents. This is also revealed in survey data that you can find. So young adults, and this matches my own direct experience, I think are more creative, more energetic. They're less constrained by boundaries, and especially rigid boundaries that may have existed for generations behind them, in my generation, and indefinitely in my parents' generation. They are less racist in general, less sexist. They're more concerned about people being treated fairly and equitably. They're more concerned about our impact on the environment. These are all very current and modern concerns. And I think because of their creativity and their openness, I think they're more likely to produce the kinds of changes and transitions that we need to do as a society. We need to be looking to them and listening to them carefully. There are young people involved in a lot of very creative endeavors having to do with the environment, for example, but also socially. You can find evidence of that everywhere, again, in the same survey data. So I think we have a lot of reason to be hopeful, but again, we have to listen to what young people are saying and respect that.
Absolutely, because at one point in our lives, we were also young people, and I could imagine way back then the older generation were also a bit ambivalent whether they should be hopeful in the future in relation to how we're going to cope with in the society. Now, what I want to ask you, Dr. Kiss, is there's this notion of industrialization of mental health care. How do you think it affects people? For lack of better term, let's just call them consumers.
Okay. Well, let's define a little bit what we're talking about. When I say industrialization, You can think of that as the mechanization of psychotherapy or mental health care. You can also think of that as the economic developments related to mental health care, such as teletherapy and the use of artificial intelligence in that regard. It offers great potential to improve access and to democratize mental health care. Historically, it has been reserved for the most affluent. There are issues related to convenience and cost, and we need to, in fact, improve access to mental health care. And there are things that are happening now, for example, with teletherapy, that do that. However, as with many good things, there can be a shadow related to this too. If, for example, these developments become codified some way into the most economically profitable or feasible changes, then we may see the negative related to industrialization. So for example, right now, as we speak, there are chatbots that are serving as what they call therapists, but they can never be an actual therapist. And it's all based on our artificial intelligence. This is just one example. There's big data being constructed around teletherapy, for example. And my concern about that is that if that's translated into kind of an automated, robotic, more austere and less human approach to helping, then it's going to have a negative impact on people. Because people will say repeatedly that it is the human interaction, it's the human relationship that is most curative and healing. And we've known that for decades. That is nothing new. So if insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies and large medical systems orient these developments to this industrialization alone, and we move away from the human element, I don't think that that's going to be helpful. At the same time, if we focus on the ingredients that do improve access, that do reduce cost, but also remain effective, then I think we're on the cusp of something that might be fantastic for the world to experience.
Absolutely. And Dr. Peace, you're not just a psychologist, but you're also an author. And I'd like to ask you, because in one of your books, you mentioned that you talk about different paradigms in mental health services. So if you could just explain to us what these different paradigms are.
Okay. I think this is a crucial concept for any mental health professional to learn about and adopt. And it's not just found in my writing. There has been other writing referring to paradigms in healthcare, for example. Those tend to be focused more on the funding models for healthcare. The paradigms I'm referring to are more philosophical. It's about the orientation that one takes toward humans and the source of their problems, which then determines how we treat them. And so I propose 4 paradigms: the intrapersonal, the extrapersonal, the societal, and the spiritual/existential. You can think of these paradigms as operating within concentric circles, with the intrapersonal being the most close to the human being. So intrapersonal, everything that is inside the person. So some systems and service models focus on the intrapersonal paradigm. That is the source of the human's problems in living and their disorders as being strictly within the human being, down to the cellular level. in some cases. So many medical systems, psychoanalysis, things like that, come from an intrapersonal paradigm. And it does have its place, as do all the paradigms, but it is not the only one. Reimbursement systems, the payment systems for healthcare and mental health care, tend to incentivize the intrapersonal paradigm, okay? Just because that's the way it's been historically. But there are other paradigms to consider, including the extrapersonal. This refers to the immediate environment around the human being. So their family, the organizations that they work in, their friend groups, the cities or towns or villages that they live in. These aspects of that paradigm can also lead to mental health issues, okay? Which is part of what that cartoon was referring to. So, for example, you may be completely healthy physiologically and so forth, but you might live in a family system or organizational system that you're working in, or a friend group that is extremely unhealthy or dysfunctional. That can give rise to mental health issues just as much, and in many cases more, than what the intrapersonal paradigm might produce. It's even greater if you consider the societal paradigm. That is, the world around the individual, beyond the family, the friend group, the organizations you work for, and so forth. So you might live in a nation or a state or a country or county that has very regressive policies and law that might affect people negatively, for example. So your listeners may have heard of the voting bills that are being proposed in the United States, restricting the right to vote. Of course, there's a lot of debate about that in either direction, and I'm not going to take up that debate right now. However, I will say that to the extent a person's democratic rights are infringed or constricted, that leads to significant mental health issues, because you don't have a voice and you no longer may have input into what's going on around you. That's also true for policy, probably even more so than law, because local governments and corporations develop policy, and these can either advance human welfare or they can constrict it. And then moving out even farther from these paradigms, we have the spiritual and existential. You might think of that as the most cosmic view of human functioning. And these approaches within that paradigm can serve to help people transcend everything that is going on around them, or not. Sometimes a spiritual or existential position can make matters worse, because there is such a thing as dysfunctional or unhealthy applications of religion, for example. It's also true that there are psychologically sound applications of religion or spirituality that advance human welfare. And so you can see that if you look at these four paradigms, it isn't just what's happening inside the individual that should be of interest. It should be a view of the human being from all four paradigms. And one or more of these paradigms may be more relevant and important and addressable than the others. And so I think a good diagnostic approach encompasses the total view of the human being. You've heard much probably of the holistic view of human beings. Well, I'm suggesting that that holistic view is enormous, or can be enormous, and in many cases should be enormous, and not as narrow maybe as what historically has been applied.
And I suppose another thing that we have to talk about is how this constellation of paradigms? How do they affect service delivery, and ultimately how do they affect the lives of clients themselves?
Okay. Well, let's just take the historically predominant one, which is the intrapersonal. If you go to a physician or a mental health provider that is in a system that emphasizes the interpersonal paradigm, they're going to look at your physiological functioning as well as perhaps your psychodynamic functioning and how that is producing symptoms. The system may incentivize this view through its billing practices and its diagnostic procedures, which do have their place. I want to emphasize that there is a time and place for such a thing, because sometimes the origin of difficulties is within the physical person or their psychological dynamics. But if that's the case, you may have a 15-minute visit with a physician followed by, let's say, a 20-minute consult with a mental health care provider who's also working in the system. And they're going to arrive at a diagnosis and focus then on your symptoms. It's the symptoms that are of interest. It's not necessarily the origin of the problem. Now, in cases where physiological functioning is the origin, for example, of the problem, that can be fine. But humans are complex, and it's rarely just the physiological functioning of the individual that is transmitting symptoms. We have to look more than that. We have to look farther than that. By the same token, there are approaches that emphasize, for example, the extrapersonal paradigm, what's going on immediately around an individual. Let's say a family systems approach to psychotherapy, for example. And that can do an enormous amount of good too, if that is the predominant contributor to the problems in living. But it can be limited too if they're excluding physiological functioning. So by now, some of you may be remembering the old biopsychosocial model. This comes closer to considering other paradigms. However, it's important to remember that the biopsychosocial model was about disease. It was about the development of disease or mental illness, not necessarily the full contextual picture of the human being. So if you're a mental health care provider, or a healthcare provider for that matter, the system that you're working in and the predominant orientation of the system that you're working in, which then means the position that the administrative host of the services is taking, you can then be guided in your view of the human being and the origin of their difficulties. And it's not such a problem that we are guided. It can be an enormous problem when we're guided and we're not aware of how we're being guided as providers. This is why awareness of the paradigms, the system that you're working in, and how it might be emphasizing one paradigm or another can have enormous impact, because it translates directly to outcomes of the individual.
And yeah, just like what you said, it impacts the individual. So I suppose as a mental health professional, how can you make informed choices about which paradigm works best for a particular individual or for a particular community?
Okay. Well, if I look away, it's because I'm looking at reference material, and this comes from my book, Delivering Effective College Mental Health Services. I do want to say that even though the book is titled that way, it is much broader than just college mental health. What it translates to is that we have to do an assessment of the community that we're living in order to pick a paradigm that is most appropriate. Let's say if you're in the position of developing services, you have to know your community and what's going on in your community. And to know the community, you have to do an assessment. And I'm not talking about the traditional needs assessments where you send out surveys, although that could be a part of what I'm referring to. There are a set of questions to answer to develop the paradigm that may be most useful or suitable for your community. Now, I'm just going to read through a couple of these questions. For example, what is known about the prevalence of diagnosed mental illness, including substance abuse and addiction, in the community? What are the most common physiological stresses for individuals? For example, what is the state of housing, food supply in deserts, clothing needs for the climate, safety and exposure to, or vulnerability to crime? Another question, describe the psychological ecosystem of the area. In what areas might one feel unwelcome or threatened? In what areas might one find affiliation and support? What is the prevailing social, religious, and political climate of the area? Who are the privileged and who are the disenfranchised? Who works in the intersections of diverse groups? Who are the joiners, the peacemakers, and who are the dividers, the splitters, and the separators? What key laws, regulations, and policies provide or constrict the well-being of the people? Is your administrative host involved in advocating for enhancements or corrections to human welfare? That's just a small sample of questions. And they're not the only questions by far. One may come up with another set of questions that are unique to your particular community. The important point, though, is you have to ask them and you have to come up with answers. And that's going to or should involve a wide, diverse range of people, not just your direct consumers, and not just the power brokers in the community, which is often a group that's turned to answer such questions. You have to get a very broad picture of your community. And once you have that, you could begin setting about developing an orientation, a predominant paradigm that is best suited for your community. And I'll just give you some examples of what I'm talking about here. So there are communities or groups where certain diagnosed mental illnesses are more predominant than in other communities, okay? There are communities where the prevailing social, religious, or political climate is very detracting, constricting for the population. The weight of each of these things, a diagnosed mental illness pattern, or on the other end, let's say the social, religious, or political climate, the weight of one may outweigh significantly the weight of the other. For example, it may be that you're in a very negative, dystopian community, and I could talk with you all day long about, let's say, your bipolar disorder, for example, and we may work on that, and we may provide you some relief and some help for that, but it will not address these other broader issues that are occurring in your community. In order for me to successfully work with you in its most broadest sense, something will have to be done about that. Now, it may be that advocacy needs to happen, and there are mental health professionals who are highly involved in advocacy. Social work comes to mind, but it's not the only one, where actual changes are made to policy and law, for example. So that may be what needs to happen. On the other hand, if that is not possible or not occurring, then I need to be working with you on improving your coping and your transcending what is going on in your community. But you can't do that if you don't have the narrative that helps explain what's going on for you. If the narrative is only about mental illness, then we're missing a large part of the narrative. We may borrow from the narrative of mental illness where that is appropriate to do, but it isn't just that you're going to have to overcome. And I found in my 30 years of work, Dennis, that many clients, no matter what their presenting condition is or their disorder might be, they just need a new narrative. A narrative that helps them understand what is happening to them, how it's happening, and why. And I found that once they arrive at a narrative that makes sense to them, it clicks, and their rate of recovery typically is much faster and smoother once they have a satisfying narrative.
Absolutely. And I also understand, Dr. Keys, that you have your own organization, Keys and Polychronics Consulting. So if you could just tell us what's the goal of your organization, and more importantly, how have you reacted in response to the COVID-19?
Well, it's been difficult in the pandemic, I think, for consultants of all types, because of the economic changes that have happened to corporations and higher education institutions and so forth. But what we do is provide consultative services really for anyone who wants to improve or address the needs of mental health systems in their community in the ways that I've just described during this hour, to broaden the view of mental health care. So we talk with employers, we talk with administrators, we talk with the media, really anyone who is interested. I think we've had 20 or so consultation partners at this point, and sometimes it's a very micro level intervention or help that we provide, and sometimes it's a micro level. It all depends on what the interests and the needs are of the consultee. We hope to grow that. After the pandemic, things may improve economically, and there may be a better landscape for consulting work. In fact, I'm hearing that changes that are coming in the fall related to reopening communities and so forth may lead to that. But that's what we do. And to be honest, we wouldn't turn away hardly any interested consultee as long as their focus was on improving or expanding mental health services.
And on a slightly more optimistic note, are there any emerging trends in the mental health or higher education sector that you're excited about as a practitioner?
Well, I think related to the pandemic, the development of teletherapy, for example, and everything that has meant, I think is extremely hopeful, but also interesting. So the private practice work that I do right now, for example, has all been by teletherapy. And it's an interesting approach because I do think it improves access. It does democratize psychotherapy to some degree because teletherapy reduces some of the traditional costs and convenience barriers for many people. So with teletherapy, this can be provided remotely in your own home, according to your own schedule. It's a much less rigid approach to the provision of psychotherapy, for example, but also healthcare in general. So it provides, I think, the greatest hope and the largest potential paradigm shift in mental health care that I've seen during my career, which is 30 years now. So that's significant. But that's only if we don't muck it up. If it's converted into an industrialization attempt, where it becomes more robotic and more limited and more rigid, then we're going to defeat ourselves from the start.
Absolutely. And Dr. Kiss, of course, you work within the higher education and you also help young adolescents. And a lot of people who would be watching this are actually in those age groups. So do you have any top tips for looking after mental health while you're at university?
I have several, and I do speak to that in the book. Well, first of all, there's been a kind of a pattern where people look at their mental health while at school in kind of a binary way. In other words, there was before and then there's after. And that's really not the way to look at really anything about mental health care. It's a continuum, it's a spectrum from youth all the way into young adulthood. It's important that you bring with you to school information, resources, even documents related to your mental health prior to entering college, that you not look at college as a totally different time where you can then switch into another mode of being. So, for example, many students stop their medications, for example, when they leave high school. They think of college as a new start. It's going to be totally different. It's going to be nothing but fun and games. And it can be for some people, but for many people it's not. It's stressful. College is one of the most stressful times, in my opinion, in life.
Absolutely.
So you have to bring with you stuff about your own mental health care. Now, what's also important, though, is that when you arrive in college, at college, you act early and promptly. Don't wait until past midterms of your first semester if you have noticed problems. You really have to act on things prior to the first third of the semester or term. Because if you don't, you're going to have a limited number of weeks to recover. So notice things early, act on things early, be aware of your local resources. People do provide this information when you first arrive at school, for the most part. A lot of people take those pamphlets and throw them in the trash as soon as they get back to their dorm room or their home. You don't want to do that. Save it, remember it, put it in your phone, and then act on it as soon as you are noticing difficulties. The sooner you notice, the quicker this can go. On average, in my experience with college students, their issues can resolve within 5 or 6 weeks. And I don't mean disappear. I just mean that they can resolve so that their functioning is better. So if you wait past midterms, you're then going to go through 5 or 6 weeks to recover, and then you will be at your final exams, okay? And that's much more difficult and stressful to wait that long.
Those are definitely wonderful tips to help you navigate, the stress in relation to being a university student. Now, do you have any tips for those who are, who want to follow your footsteps as a psychologist working within higher education? What's your advice?
Okay. Well, so the career pathway in college mental health is a fairly clear one. I was lucky enough when I was in my doctoral training to be exposed to college mental health at the campus where I went to school. I knew about it, I learned about it. I was very attracted to the population. And you have to begin identifying the landscape of college mental health and the potential for training that's specific to that area. So at the conclusion of my doctoral training, and this can be true of master's level training too, you're provided with internship opportunities. And it's best, if you want to continue in this field, to find an internship at a college counseling center or a college mental health service. And they're available, and this information is known. You do have to dig around a little bit because it's not as well known as, for example, the hospital pathway or the medical pathway, but it exists. And then once you're in the internship opportunity, things begin unfolding pretty naturally from there because employment opportunities will arise. And because you've had a very specific internship experience in a college setting, that's going to make you attractive. The more experience people have in the college mental health setting, the better. Because my belief is that it is a specialty. It is not like mental health work in any other setting, in my opinion. It ought to be formally classified as a specialty, but it is not yet. And there are organizations, accrediting agencies, and so forth that are oriented toward college mental health. So it has its own separate universe, and the more you know about that, the better and the smoother pathway you'll have.
Absolutely. And Dr. Keys, who inspires you both professionally and personally?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. I have been influenced by some of the masters in the reading that I did. And I'll be honest with you, most of this reading occurred outside of my training. So it's reading that I did on my own. People like Irvin Yalom, James Masterson, some of the Neo-Freudian authors. And keep in mind, I don't consider myself to be a Freudian. I consider myself to be more of an integrationist. But I like the view, really, that led to the development of these paradigms that I'm proposing. Reading and authors that contributed to each one of them in their own way. Okay, so some of these authors will contribute, let's say, to the intrapersonal paradigm or the extrapersonal paradigm. But I also have enjoyed authors and readings that really are about the social and the spiritual or existential paradigms. So sociology, anthropology, religion, all have things to say, important things to say about people and our problems in living. And I think my own personal religious orientation and activity has contributed to that significantly. And that orientation originates in Scotland. Scotland has a long, difficult history, as a lot of countries do, of course. But its enlightenment and its development of the Church of Scotland and the story that the Covenanters went through to address their religious freedom, which, by the way, was the cause of our leaving Scotland, and then later Northern Ireland, and then later coming to America, where my ancestors founded some Presbyterian churches here. All of that has tremendous meaning for me. So when you think about overemphasizing symptoms, I think about my ancestors and what they went through. And the story of my ancestors, I think, is the same story that many people have. It's just a different religious or cultural context. But that kind of search for freedom and independence and development of self and family, I think that offered me a view that broadens how I think of people and what their needs are.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And Dr. Keys, like what you've mentioned earlier, you've been working within the mental health and working within higher education for about 30 years now. So I'm quite sure that you've come across a number of misconceptions. So if you could kind of identify those misconceptions and address them.
About this field of work?
Yes, about your field of work, about adolescent mental health.
Yeah, okay. Well, the main one that I heard very early in my career and still persists is that, oh, you must have an easy job. You only work with normal people. Okay, which, I mean, there's all sorts of questions about what even normal means. It really doesn't mean a whole lot. Or that they have, insignificant concerns or problems, or, you only see people who have adjustment disorders, that kind of thing. The worried well is what many authors have called this kind of population, not just young adults, but also adults. And I'm here to tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. Adolescents, young adults, college students are just like everyone else. They do have privileges as a general rule, although not every college student is privileged by far. I worked with students who were living out of their car or couldn't afford books, that kind of thing. But they're just as diverse as any other population. And what that means is that their mental health issues and even their diagnoses are just as diverse. I think during my career, I probably have seen nearly every major diagnosis there is in the book. Some quite severe, some mild, and then everything in between, just as I would if I were to work in a hospital or any other mental health setting. So I think there's a diversity in the population that's important to recognize. And not just with respect to mental health, but with respect to their identities. Every identity that you can think of is represented in the college environment. Maybe even more so because it's such a rich environment. You get many, many people coming together from all over the world in some of the larger schools. And so you see every kind of person, every kind of situation, and so forth. It makes for a very rich and rewarding work environment that is still true today, in spite of some of the difficulties in higher education. I believe it's still true. In general, college students do tend to be brighter and more flexible due to their age, really. You would hope that a college student is brighter than the average person. That too is not always the case. But in general, because of their attributes, they tend to recover quickly, they learn quickly. It's a very dynamic time in life when all sorts of unique challenges occur and you learn from them. You make mistakes as a college student. Anybody who's in college can remember the mistakes that they made, right? I don't know anyone who didn't make mistakes in school. Really any other time in life too, but I think especially in school. And because they can recover so quickly, because they're flexible and they're there to learn, that's the purpose of the whole environment, you get to see changes happen rapidly and sometimes very dramatically. As I mentioned to you earlier, on average in 5 or 6 weeks, if the work is going well. And that makes for a very rewarding work experience. I encourage anyone who is considering that to look into it.
Absolutely. And Dr. Keys, what's the big message? What's the most important thing you want the people to know about you and the work that you do?
Well, regarding me, I would just say that I'm not alone. You know, the views that I have, the experiences that I've had are not unique to me. There's a whole community of people who may say very similar things. But what I do want your audience to hear is there is an expansive view of human beings and the nature of the problems in living. The more expansive we are in understanding those things, the more thorough we will be, and the better outcomes that we'll have, and the faster those outcomes will occur. So for that reason, be aware of paradigmatic approaches in your community, in your area of work, and so on. Be aware of those influences and how they may constrict you as an employee and as a provider, or how they might enhance what you do. And if you find that they are constricting, devote some of your career and your time to expansion, to expanding the attitudes, the perspectives, the philosophies of those who work with you. I think people will find that there is a hunger for this. There are obstacles, primarily economic, related to all that, but it is very much worth your time, especially if you're in a leadership role, to begin the process of policy change, procedural change in such a way that expands the nature of what you do and therefore helps the people that you work with.
Absolutely. And how do you relax? What's the stress about it?
You know, that's a really important question. So I do want to pass along wisdom that was given to me long ago. I think it's important that mental health professionals pass along wisdom that has helped them, because I stand on those who went before me. And the one piece of advice I would give is be crystal clear about what you are and you are not responsible for. If you are not crystal clear, that's going to lead to enormously high stress levels, okay? Because we, just like any type of employee, we can't fix everything. We can't address every concern or problem. We have a limited set of tools, all of us do, because we're humans. We're limited by our training and so forth. Be aware of what your tools are and what they're not. Develop the tools that you need, but also don't take on commitments or responsibilities that are outside of your areas of competence or responsibility. So that's one thing. Probably the most important piece of advice that I have. Other things are more practical, though. Remember that you are also not a mental health professional. You have other identities, a family member, a friend, any of the dimensions of human experience, you have an identity. And don't forget to pursue those things. This work can be demanding, and if we're not careful, we get kind of unidimensional when we are only an employee, we are only a helper, and that's all we do, that's all we are, and that is dangerous. That will lead to burnout and really a loss of meaning and hope. You don't want that. So, you know, for me, I used to like to ride motorcycles. My legs don't permit that anymore. It makes me a little unsteady. Time on a motorcycle was a great relaxing activity. It got me out in nature and so forth. I'm a baseball fan. I watch a lot of baseball. It's very comforting to me. Also, I'm an amateur genealogist. I do a lot of family history. I'm a church member and an elder in that church. I could go on, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
Carry out other aspects of your identity.
Yeah, that's a lovely message, because you're more than just, you know, the chosen profession that you have.
Yes.
But another thing that I want to ask you, Dr. Keys, is what do you think you would be doing if you didn't work as a psychologist?
Well, I probably would be a teacher, and that was my first career, actually. I was a teacher for 2 years before I went back and got trained as a psychologist. I love teaching. I still love it. In fact, a big part of what I do is actually teaching. The hour I've spent with you today, in some respects, is teaching. So I'd probably be a teacher, just in some other setting. The reason I got into psychology is that I found that I was helping people with their other personal problems, the students that I was working with, just as much, in some cases, not more, than the educational aspect of what I was doing. But that's probably what I would be.
And finally, Dr. Keys, what else is in the pipeline? And if people wanted to reach out to you, what platforms can they get in touch with you at?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Dr. Lee Keys. I'm also on LinkedIn. I do have a Facebook page called College Mental Health. I do quite a bit there. You can find me on the Johns Hopkins University author page through their university press there, and so forth. There's various ways you can reach out to me.
And any upcoming books, events?
Well, you know, I always have a book in mind. They're easier, in my experience, they're easier to write than they are to start, because I have to get all my ideas together. I think maybe my next book will be more vignettes, stories, if you will, that illustrate, for example, the 4 paradigms, and so forth. I write journal articles and some other internet pieces and so forth. In fact, I have one in mind for you that I'll be following up about. Yeah.
That's something to look forward to. Your article on PsycReg, but absolutely those vignettes. I think that would be really useful for people who want to work within counseling and mental health. But Dr. Leakes, it's really a pleasure having you here on the VRH show. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time, but I look forward to hearing more about your work. And I put all the links that you gave me to the description notes so that people who want to learn more about what you said can follow it through.
Great. It's been a pleasure being here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Keys.
Okay.